Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. After I retired from the police, I thought a camping trip would be the perfect way to clear my head. My career had been long, and I was looking forward to some peace. I found a quiet spot far from any campgrounds, deep in the woods. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise and people. Years of dealing with stress had taken its toll, and I needed the break. The first day went fine. I put up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made dinner as the sun dipped below the trees. Being alone out there felt calming, like the quiet nights when I used to patrol empty streets. But this was different. No radio, no backup, no need to watch my back. Just me and the forest. As the sun disappeared, the woods grew dark and still. The only sound was the fire crackling beside me. I stared into the flames, letting my thoughts wander. But after a while, that old feeling started creeping in. The one I'd had on the job, the feeling that something wasn't right. I hadn't seen or heard anything strange, but it was there, deep in my gut. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the area. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no animals, no wind, just the quiet forest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe all those years in law enforcement had left me jumpy. Maybe I was imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I got up and walked around my camp a few times, checking everything. Still nothing. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I went into my tent and zipped it up, lying there with my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Hours went by, and all I heard was the occasional breeze rustling the leaves, but nothing else. Then, sometime early in the morning, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, followed by the snapping of twigs. My heart raced. I knew the sounds animals made, and this wasn't one of them. The steps were slow and steady, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. Whoever it was, they were right outside. I sat up quietly, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and listened. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds as if they were waiting or maybe watching. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just sat there, holding my breath, hoping they'd move on. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Nothing. No more movement. After a while, I decided I had to look. I unzipped the tent slowly, my flashlight ready, and shined the light outside. The camp was empty. Everything was just as I had left it, but I knew someone had been there. I could feel it deep in my bones. The rest of the night, I sat up, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. My eyes stayed locked on the tent door, but nothing else happened. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and got out of there. I didn't care how long it took. I just wanted to leave. About a mile from where I had camped, I found them. Footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't from any animal. These were boot prints, and they followed the same trail I had walked the day before. They came from deep in the woods, passed right by my camp, and continued down the trail. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing by. They had watched me. They could have come right up to my tent if they wanted to. They chose not to. That's what bothers me the most. They didn't do anything, didn't make a sound, just walked around and left. I left the mountains without looking back. I've been in dangerous situations before, but nothing felt as unsettling as knowing I was being watched and that whoever it was had no good reason to be there. Those woods aren't the peaceful escape I thought they were. The quiet is too deep, too empty, like it's hiding something. I've learned that no matter where you go, even in the most remote places, you're never really alone. Someone is always out there, watching, waiting. They might not show themselves, but they're there. And next time, they might not leave you alone. Last summer, I went camping with my son. He's a sergeant now, tough as they come, and had been wanting us to get out into the woods again like we used to. We picked a spot deep in the forest, far away from the regular paths where people hike. That's how he likes it. The air was cool, the trees were thick, and the ground was soft under our boots. We set up camp pretty fast. My son was all focused, making sure everything was just right, checking our stuff and looking around the area. The first night was easy. We ate, talked a little, then got into our tents. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get out there in the wild. The next day, we went on a long hike. He led the way and I stayed close behind him. I could see how his military training kicked in, the way he moved, always watching, always on alert. It made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong with him nearby. But by the third night, something felt off. We were sitting by the fire, and I noticed my son kept looking into the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a habit he picked up in the army. But then I heard it too, soft crunching sounds, just outside the light of the fire. Could have been an animal, I thought, a deer or something, but the noise didn't stop. Every few minutes it came back, moving from one side of the camp to the other. My son got up and started looking into the dark, scanning the trees. He gave me a look that said we should put the fire out. The second the flames went out, the noise stopped too. We sat there, not saying anything, just listening. Nothing. It was dead quiet. I started to think maybe we were both just hearing things, that it was all in our heads. But my son didn't think so. He quietly moved around, checking everything one more time, and then motioned for us to stay put and wait until morning. That night, neither of us got much sleep. We heard the same sounds, like something was moving around the camp, but it never came close enough for us to see what it was. By the time the sun started coming up, the noises were gone. We didn't waste any time packing up and getting out of there. But as we walked back along the trail, we saw footprints in the dirt. They weren't from any animal. They were human. Bare feet, no shoes, and they had circled our camp all night. The tracks came close to where our tents were, then backed off into the woods. We didn't say a word, but we both knew what it meant. Someone had been watching us the whole time, sneaking around in the dark. The feeling of being followed stayed with me even after we got back to the car. My son didn't say much, but I could see the tension on his face. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the trees. I knew someone had been out there watching us, waiting. We didn't hear them leave. We didn't hear them run off or walk away. They just stopped moving when the sun came up. But they were still out there, hiding in the trees. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They didn't make a mistake. They had been patient, too patient. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they weren't done watching us yet. My wife and I needed to get away from the busy city and all its noise, so we decided to go camping deep in the woods. We found a spot far away from other campers. It was quiet, just the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere far off. At first, it felt peaceful, but after a while, that silence started to feel too deep, like something wasn't right. The first night was okay. We set up our tent, made a fire, and cooked our dinner. The stillness was nice in a way, but by the second day, I started noticing small things that felt off. I'd find branches broken in strange ways, like they'd been snapped by something too strong to be a deer. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe just the wind. But something about it kept bothering me. Later that day, I went looking for more firewood and came across a tree about 50 feet away from our campsite. It had strange carvings in its bark. These weren't just scratches. They looked like someone had hacked into the tree with something sharp. The carvings were deep, rough shapes, almost like figures standing in a circle, all facing inward. There was something about them that felt wrong, like they were there on purpose. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to worry her over something that could just be a strange coincidence. But that night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about those carvings. Felt like we weren't really alone out there. We eventually crawled into the tent and tried to get some sleep, but it was hard. The air felt heavy, like something thick was pressing down around us. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, moving in a circle around our tent. I froze, just listening. They'd stop, then start again, closer each time. It sounded like someone was pacing, right outside. My heart was pounding, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to see out. There, standing at the edge of the trees about 30 feet away, was a man. He was tall, thin, and filthy, with wild hair tangled up with leaves and twigs, like he had been living in the forest itself. His clothes were dirty and blended in with the trees, like he was part of them. He stood with his back to me, facing into the woods, his head tilted as if he was listening to something. In his hands, he held 2 pieces of wood, rubbing them together slowly. I ducked back into the tent, my heart racing, unsure what to do. We were deep in the woods with no way to call for help. Part of me thought about grabbing a knife, but I knew it wouldn't be enough out here, miles away from anyone. The footsteps started again, louder this time, moving in slow circles around us. They never stopped, like he was waiting. We lay there in silence, listening to him walk around the tent until the first light of dawn finally broke through. When the sun was up, the footsteps stopped. We packed up as fast as we could, throwing everything in the car, not even talking to each other. The air felt wrong, like the trees were closing in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I started driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was there, standing at the edge of the road, watching us leave. That night, back at home, I couldn't get him out of my mind. The way he'd moved, the way he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. I remembered the carvings on the tree, the rough figures all standing in a circle, facing each other. That's when I realized they weren't random shapes. They were people like us, standing together, facing each other in silence. It hit me then that he had been waiting for something, waiting for us. And out there, in the dark of the woods, there were probably others. Other people who had come before us, drawn into that silent circle, now just marks on a tree. It was like he was part of the woods, and now he had seen us, like he'd made his choice. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, someday, I'd hear those footsteps again, closer this time, just outside my door. I'd set up my tent in a quiet spot high up in the mountains, far from any trails or people. The rain had started off as a light sprinkle earlier in the evening, but by the time it got dark, it had turned into a full-on downpour. I could hear the rain pounding against the tent, a constant sound that drowned out everything else. The ground underneath me was slowly turning into mud, and I could feel the wetness seeping through, chilling me from below. I was completely alone, and with every minute, that loneliness seemed to grow stronger. The wind picked up, shaking the trees all around me. Every gust seemed stronger than the last, and soon the branches above were creaking and swaying in the dark, as if they were warning me. I tried to ignore the growing feeling of unease creeping up my back, but the storm made everything feel tense, like something was out there, hiding just beyond my tent. Then, through the noise of the storm, I noticed something strange. In the middle of the rain and wind, I heard a dull thud. I froze, straining my ears to listen through the pounding rain. Another thud. It was close, closer than I wanted to believe. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch falling or maybe a rock tumbling down the hill. But the sounds kept coming, and they weren't steady like rain or shifting branches. They seemed too heavy, like slow steps coming right toward me. I sat there, barely breathing, listening as the steps grew louder, circling my tent. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. Maybe a lost animal or some hiker off the trail. But then I remembered just how remote this place was. I'd hiked for miles off the main path, and in this weather, no one would be out here wandering in the storm. The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. I couldn't see anything. I hadn't brought a lantern, just a small flashlight that was already starting to dim from use. I clutched it tightly, hoping the rain would cover the sound of my quick, heavy breathing. Then, slowly, I felt the side of my tent pressing inward. Something was pushing on the thin fabric, carefully, almost like it was testing it. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I watched the wall of the tent bow under the pressure. This wasn't an animal, it was too careful, too controlled. Someone or something was outside, just standing there, listening, feeling along the edges of my tent. After what felt like hours, the pressure finally stopped, and I heard the footsteps again, moving away into the storm. I sat there, holding my breath, and waited, but the footsteps didn't return. When I finally dared to move, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a crack, shining the light outside. The rain poured down, but I could see deep footprints in the mud, circling my tent and leading off into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, waiting for the sun, feeling the heavy cold of the rain sink deeper into me. When dawn finally came, I packed up and left as fast as I could. But as I hiked out of that clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, hidden somewhere in those thick, dark woods, waiting for me to let my guard down. And as I looked over my shoulder one last time, I spotted something strange. Among the trees, just far enough to be nearly out of sight, was a shape, a figure motionless, barely visible in the shadows. It stood there, perfectly still, like it had been there all along, watching me with a patience that felt inhuman. I didn't wait to find out if it would follow. My neighbor, Miguel, and I had become close friends over the years. We worked out together at the gym, and since we lived in the same neighborhood, we often talked about our weekends and things going on in our lives. One day, Miguel came up with the idea that we should go camping in the Andes Mountains, a place he said would be a perfect break from the city noise, surrounded by mountains, forests, and open sky. We packed up our stuff, loaded the car, and drove far out into the mountains. The more we hiked, the colder the air got, sharp and biting even through our jackets. But it was beautiful out there. Snowy peaks stretched as far as we could see, and the thick trees around us looked ancient, almost untouched. Just as the sun began to set behind the mountains, we found a small clearing and decided to make camp there. That night, the cold was intense, sinking deep into my bones. We sat by the fire, mostly silent, just listening to the crackle of burning wood and the faint sounds of animals in the distance. As I sat there, I felt a strange silence, a weight in the air, like something pressing in on my ears. It was almost suffocating, but I pushed the feeling aside, thinking it was just the quiet of the mountains, unlike anything I'd felt before. The first night went by with no problems. The second day, we decided to hike higher up the mountain. By the time it was getting dark, we found a flat ledge that overlooked a deep valley, so we set up our tent there. From that spot, the forest below looked like an endless sea of dark green, stretching out as far as we could see. Miguel and I snapped a few pictures, then got ready for bed, thinking we'd see even more in the morning. Around midnight, I suddenly woke up. The air inside the tent felt strangely heavy, as if something was pressing down on us. Miguel was fast asleep beside me, so I quietly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the pitch-black night, showing nothing but trees and shadows outside. But then I heard it. It was far away, but it was clear, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps crunching slowly through dried leaves. I froze, holding my breath to listen. The sound was coming from the forest below us, echoing up from somewhere in the dark trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I listened closer, I realized it was too steady, too heavy, with a slow rhythm that no animal would make. It sounded exactly like footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate. For hours, I lay there, listening to those footsteps moving back and forth below us, never getting closer, but never fading away either. Whoever or whatever was down there seemed to be pacing, covering the same ground over and over, as if it were waiting for something. At one point, I thought I saw a faint, dim light moving between the trees, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, Miguel and I packed up as fast as we could. We didn't talk about the footsteps or the strange light from the night before. As we hiked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, hidden in the trees, watching us leave. But everything around us was silent, almost too silent, like the forest was holding its breath. When we finally got back to the main road, Miguel paused and looked back at the mountains one last time. His face was pale and he looked uneasy, like he'd felt it too. I didn't need to ask. I knew he'd heard it, those slow, steady footsteps pacing in the dark. I never went back to those mountains, and neither did Miguel. We never spoke about that night again. But sometimes, late at night, I lie awake, hearing those footsteps in my mind, slow, unending, like they're still out there, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, someone will be foolish enough to camp there again, to hear those footsteps pacing closer, step by step, until it's too late to leave. It was late summer, and my uncle and aunt decided to take me camping in a quiet part of the woods. I was really looking forward to it. We drove for hours, finally reaching a hidden campsite surrounded by tall trees and a calm lake. The sun was going down, painting everything in orange light. My uncle set up the tent while my aunt got a fire going. As night came, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. The forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and sometimes a distant animal making noise. After a while, my aunt went to bed, leaving my uncle and me sitting by the fire. I loved being out here, feeling free and wild. Later, my uncle suggested a quick night hike. I was excited and agreed right away. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped into the cool, dark woods. At first, it was fun, wandering along the trails and shining our lights on the trees. But soon, the air turned colder, and the silence felt heavier. My uncle pointed out some animal tracks, and I felt a thrill, picturing the creatures that roamed this place. As we went deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. A low, creepy sound, almost like a soft growl. I turned to my uncle, but he was already walking ahead, his flashlight beam bouncing in the distance. I hurried to catch up, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, more intense, like it was coming from somewhere off the trail. We pressed on, and then I heard something move in the bushes nearby. My stomach dropped. It didn't feel like just an animal. I had this weird feeling that we were being watched. I caught up to my uncle, who had stopped, his flashlight pointing at something in the shadows. I couldn't see what it was, but a chill ran down my spine. Without saying a word, we turned around and picked up the pace. That creepy sound followed us, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as we rushed through the darkness, the flashlight beams flickering. Each snap of a twig made me jump. The trees felt like they were closing in around us, and the night seemed more alive than ever. Finally, we reached the campsite. My aunt was sitting by the fire, looking puzzled as she stared at our faces. My uncle and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. "What happened?" my aunt asked, but we were too shaken to respond. My uncle just shook his head, still staring into the woods like he was waiting for something to come out. We decided to pack up early in the morning. The sounds of the forest felt different now, less friendly. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees. It was then I noticed something in the shadows, two glowing eyes watching us. My heart sank. That camping trip was supposed to be fun, but now it felt like something dark was lurking in those woods, waiting. I realized that nature, while beautiful, can also be deeply unsettling. That night would haunt me every time I thought of it, and I knew I'd never forget those eyes watching from the dark, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. It was a warm weekend in late summer when my wife, her mother, and I decided to go camping. We found a spot near a small lake surrounded by thick trees, far from the noise of the city. I wanted to get closer to my mother-in-law, hoping this trip would be a good way to connect. As we set up our tent, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed strangely far away. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just because we were in such a remote place. After we got settled in, we spent the day fishing and roasting hot dogs over the fire. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campsite. Later, as darkness fell, I sat by the fire while my wife and her mother got their sleeping bags ready inside the tent. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering light against the dark trees. I watched the smoke rise, thinking about how peaceful it felt, but something bothered me, an uneasy feeling creeping in as the night deepened. Around midnight, I heard a rustling sound coming from the woods. It wasn't the usual nighttime noises. This was heavier, almost like something was moving on purpose. I stood up, trying to see through the dark. A chill ran down my spine. The rustling stopped, replaced by a silence that felt too thick. I wanted to wake my wife, but I hesitated, thinking maybe it was just an animal. The next hour dragged on. I kept looking toward the trees, feeling like someone was watching me. I tried to push away the fear, telling myself it was nothing. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark shape slipped between the trees, just beyond the light of my flashlight. My heart raced. I pointed the light in that direction, but nothing was there. I decided to check on my mother-in-law and wife. As I unzipped the tent, I saw them both sound asleep, their faces relaxed. I almost felt bad for waking them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, I heard it again, a loud snap of a branch. This time it was closer. I stepped outside the tent, holding the flashlight tightly. I could see a figure standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by shadows. It looked like a man, but he was just standing there, not moving. My breath caught in my throat, and panic rushed through me. I tried to call out for my wife, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen as I shined the light toward the figure. It stepped back into the darkness, and I quickly ran inside the tent, zipping it up tight. I felt like a coward, but I couldn't face whatever was out there. The next few hours felt like a nightmare. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening for any sound that might mean the figure was gone. Finally, just as dawn broke, the world outside woke up with chirping birds and the sound of leaves moving in the breeze. Felt like a new day, but I still couldn't shake the fear. When my wife and her mother woke up, I told them what happened. They laughed, thinking it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But I couldn't forget the fear that had gripped me. We decided to pack up early. As we left the campsite, I spotted something in the dirt. A deep footprint leading into the trees, much larger than any animal's. I didn't say anything to them, but the sight of that footprint sent chills through me. I had tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us all night. I told myself it was just a camping trip, but deep down, I knew I'd never feel safe in the woods again. Then, as we turned onto the main road, I glanced back at the campsite. The trees looked darker now, almost as if they were closing in. A thought struck me. What if that figure was still out there, watching? The more I thought about it, the more the fear bubbled up inside me. I remembered how still the night had been, how the usual sounds of nature had vanished. I recalled that heavy silence after the rustling stopped, how it felt like the world was holding its breath. I looked at my wife and her mother, who were chatting about the trip. They had no idea of the real danger we had faced. Then, in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement in the trees. My heart sank. I didn't say anything, but the image of that dark shape loomed in my mind. I drove faster, desperate to put distance between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. As we finally reached the city, I took a deep breath, but it did nothing to ease my worry. The woods might have looked peaceful during the day, but I knew the truth. We were lucky to leave, but whatever was out there was still lurking, waiting for the next chance to come closer. The fear settled in my chest, a reminder that some places hold secrets best left alone, and some shadows never truly fade away.